History loves to celebrate the wealthy and powerful. But what happens when someone becomes so rich that their very existence threatens to collapse entire economies? What happens when generosity becomes a weapon of mass economic destruction? This is the story of Mansa Musa, a 14th-century African emperor who was so wealthy that economists today struggle to calculate his net worth. Some estimate it at over $400 billion in modern currency. But here's the contradiction that will blow your mind. This man was so generous, so incredibly giving, that his charity literally crashed the gold market across 3 continents for an entire decade. His kindness was so extreme, it became dangerous. Picture this. You're so rich that when you go on vacation, you accidentally destroy international trade routes. You're so wealthy that your pilgrimage becomes an economic tsunami that reshapes global finance. This isn't just a story about money. This is about how one man's religious journey became a geopolitical earthquake that shifted power from Europe to Africa and back again. How does a devout Muslim ruler from West Africa become the most economically disruptive force of the medieval world? The year is 1324. Europe is struggling through famines and political chaos. The Crusades have ended in failure. Meanwhile, in West Africa, the Mali Empire stretches across an area larger than Western Europe, controlling the world's most valuable trade routes. Gold flows north across the Sahara like rivers of liquid wealth, while salt, more precious than gold in tropical regions, flows south. But this isn't the Africa that European textbooks taught you about. This is an Africa of magnificent universities, complex banking systems, and architectural marvels that rivaled anything in Paris or London. At the heart of this empire sits a man who controls more wealth than entire European kingdoms combined. In 1324, Mansa Musa makes a decision that will echo through history. He's going to fulfill his religious obligation and make the Hajj to Mecca. But this won't be any ordinary pilgrimage. This will be a parade of wealth so extravagant, so mind-bendingly opulent, that it will fundamentally alter how the world understands power, wealth, and Africa itself. What he doesn't realize is that his act of religious devotion is about to become the most economically destructive journey in human history. The ripple effects of his generosity will reach from Cairo to Constantinople, from Venice to Marrakech, creating an economic crisis that will last for years and forever change how international finance operates. To understand how Mansa Musa became dangerously wealthy, we need to travel back to his rise to power in 1312. But first, imagine the geography that made his empire possible. The Mali Empire wasn't just vast, it was strategically positioned at the crossroads of 3 crucial trade networks: the gold mines of Bambouk and Bouré to the south, the salt mines of Tagaza to the north, and the trans-Saharan trade routes connecting sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world. Musa inherited more than just a kingdom. He inherited a monopoly. Every single grain of gold that traveled from West Africa to the Mediterranean world had to pass through his territory. Every block of salt that moved south had to be taxed by his government. It was like owning the only bridge across a river that everyone needed to cross. But Mansa Musa didn't just inherit wealth, he revolutionized it. Where previous rulers had been content to tax trade, Musa understood something that European kings were only beginning to grasp: control the supply, control the price. He implemented what we would today recognize as vertical integration, controlling gold mines, transportation routes, and even the markets where gold was sold. Picture yourself as a medieval merchant. You need gold. It's the international currency of the 14th century. But there's only one reliable source: West Africa. And there's only one man who controls that source: Mansa Musa. You have 3 choices: pay his prices, find another route, which doesn't exist, or go without gold, which means you can't conduct international trade. This geographical monopoly created what economists call inelastic demand. No matter how high Musa raised his prices, people still had to pay them. It's like being the only gas station on a desert highway, except instead of gas, you're selling the fundamental currency of international commerce. But Musa's first true test came not from economics, but from politics. When he inherited the throne, several provincial governors decided this young ruler might be easy to manipulate. They were catastrophically wrong. In 1313, just 1 year after taking power, Musa faced his first major crisis. The governor of the gold-rich region of Bambouk declared independence, cutting off nearly half of Mali's gold supply. For any other medieval ruler, this would have meant economic disaster and probably civil war. Musa's response revealed the strategic brilliance that would define his reign. Instead of immediately launching a military campaign, he did something unexpected. He flooded the market with gold from his other sources, driving down prices so dramatically that the rebellious province's stockpiled gold became nearly worthless overnight. Think about the psychological warfare at play here. You're a governor who thinks you can challenge the emperor by controlling gold mines. Suddenly, gold becomes so cheap that your trump card becomes worthless paper. The message was clear. Mansa Musa controlled so much wealth that he could afford to crash his own product's value just to make a point. The governor surrendered within 6 months. But the real victory wasn't political. It was the demonstration of economic power that reverberated across the medieval world. European merchants began to understand that this African emperor wasn't just rich. He was powerful enough to manipulate international markets at will. What made Mansa Musa's wealth truly dangerous was how systematically he built the infrastructure to manage it. Medieval Europe was still largely a barter economy with limited banking systems. Musa created something that wouldn't appear in Europe for another century: a complex financial network that could move wealth across thousands of miles. He established what were essentially banks in major trading cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Jenne. These weren't just places to store gold. They were sophisticated financial institutions that could issue what we would recognize as letters of credit. A merchant could deposit gold in Timbuktu and withdraw the equivalent value in Cairo, minus Musa's transaction fee. Of course, this system gave Musa something that no European ruler possessed: liquid wealth that could be deployed anywhere in the known world within months. While European kings were still struggling to collect taxes from their own territories, Musa could finance military campaigns, construction projects, or religious expeditions across 3 continents. But this financial innovation created an unexpected problem. Musa's wealth was becoming so vast and his economic systems so efficient that he was starting to accumulate gold faster than he could spend it. His treasury was literally overflowing. For most people, this would be the ultimate problem to have. For Mansa Musa, a devout Muslim, it created a spiritual crisis. Islamic law emphasizes charity and warns against hoarding wealth. The richer he became, the more urgent his need to give became. And in 1324, he decided to solve both problems at once. He would make the Hajj to Mecca, and he would bring enough wealth to demonstrate both his piety and his power to the Islamic world. What he didn't anticipate was that his generosity would become a form of economic warfare that would reshape international finance for decades to come. The morning sun rises over Niani, the capital of Mali, on what will become the most expensive religious journey in human history. It's early 1324, and Mansa Musa is preparing for his Hajj to Mecca. But this isn't preparation. This is mobilization. Imagine the scene: 60,000 people preparing to cross the Sahara Desert. But these aren't ordinary pilgrims. This is a caravan that includes 12,000 personal slaves, each carrying 4 pounds of gold. 500 slaves march ahead of Musa himself, each carrying a 6-pound golden staff. Behind them, 80 camels struggle under the weight of 300 pounds of gold each. The math is staggering. Conservative estimates suggest Musa brought over 21 tons of gold on this journey. That's roughly $1.5 billion in today's currency, and that's just what he carried for spending money. But here's what makes this pilgrimage truly dangerous. Mansa Musa had no concept of inflation. In his empire, gold was so abundant that giving it away was like handing out flowers. He was about to enter economies where gold was scarce and precious, and he was going to treat it like pocket change. 3 months into the journey, Musa's caravan reaches Cairo, the economic heart of the Eastern Mediterranean. Picture yourself as a Cairo merchant in 1324. Your city is one of the wealthiest in the world, a crucial stop on trade routes between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Gold is precious here. It takes months of negotiation to acquire significant amounts. Then, one morning, the richest man in the world walks into your city and starts giving gold away like candy. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that sound like economic fantasy. Al-Umari, a Syrian historian, interviewed eyewitnesses who told him that Musa distributed gold so freely in Cairo's markets that its value dropped by 10 to 25% overnight. But the emperor wasn't finished. He stayed in Cairo for 3 months, and every day brought new displays of generosity that defied economic logic. Musa didn't just give gold to the poor. He gave it to merchants, government officials, scholars, and anyone who showed him hospitality. He purchased provisions for his massive caravan at prices so high that Cairo's merchants couldn't believe their luck. A contemporary account describes him buying dates at triple their market value simply because he liked their quality. But the most economically destructive moment came during his visit to the Sultan of Egypt. Protocol required gift exchanges between visiting rulers. The Sultan, prepared for normal diplomatic generosity, presented Musa with gifts worth perhaps a few hundred dinars in gold. Musa's response? He gave the Sultan gifts worth over 50,000 dinars, roughly $4 million in modern currency. The psychological impact was immediate. Egyptian officials, accustomed to being the wealthy powers in diplomatic exchanges, suddenly found themselves embarrassingly outmatched. More dangerously, Musa's generosity created instant inflation in Cairo's luxury goods market. As merchants realized, they could charge this visitor almost anything. What happened next demonstrates how medieval economics were more interconnected than most people realize. Cairo wasn't an isolated market. It was a crucial link in trade networks stretching from Venice to India. When gold prices collapsed in Cairo, the effects rippled outward like an earthquake. Mediterranean merchants who had planned to purchase gold in Cairo suddenly found their business models destroyed. Venetian traders who had sailed east expecting to buy gold at established prices discovered that the market had fundamentally shifted. Some turned massive profits by purchasing undervalued gold in Cairo and selling it in Europe. Others, caught with overpriced gold from other sources, faced financial ruin. The situation became even more complex as word of Musa's wealth spread. European merchants began to understand that their assumptions about African poverty were catastrophically wrong. If this was what a single African emperor could spend on a religious journey, what did that suggest about Africa's total wealth? But Musa wasn't finished. From Cairo, the caravan continued to Mecca, leaving behind an economically traumatized Egypt. In the Holy City, Musa's generosity reached new extremes. He distributed gold not just to the poor, but to the infrastructure of the pilgrimage itself, paying for improvements to religious sites, funding charitable institutions, and supporting other pilgrims who couldn't afford their own journeys. Contemporary accounts suggest that Musa's spending in Mecca was so extravagant that it influenced Islamic charitable practices for decades afterward. Future pilgrims found themselves measured against a standard of generosity that was literally impossible to match. The political implications were equally dramatic. The Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt and the Levant, suddenly realized that this African emperor commanded wealth that dwarfed their own. The balance of power in the Islamic world had shifted, and they hadn't even noticed it happening. By the time Musa began his journey home, the economic chaos he had unleashed was becoming clear. But now he faced a new problem. He was running out of gold. The man who had started his journey with 21 tons of precious metal had given away so much that his return journey was in jeopardy. This led to one of the most ironic moments in economic history. In Medina, Musa was forced to borrow money at extremely high interest rates from Egyptian merchants who had profited from his earlier generosity. The richest man in the world had to take out loans to get home, but even this created economic disruption. The interest rates on these loans were so high that they affected lending practices throughout the region. Musa's borrowing spree inadvertently introduced new concepts about credit and international lending to medieval Middle Eastern finance. When Musa finally returned to Mali in late 1325, he had been gone for nearly 2 years and had fundamentally altered international economics. But the most surprising development was waiting for him at home. His empire had grown even richer in his absence. With reduced gold supply in international markets due to his giveaways, the price of Mali's gold had increased dramatically in Europe and Asia. The gold mines that Musa controlled were now more valuable than ever. His generosity had accidentally created artificial scarcity that increased his wealth. This put Musa in an impossible position. The more generous he had been, the richer he had become. His attempt to follow Islamic teachings about charity and humility had made him even more dangerously wealthy than before. European merchants were now actively seeking trade relationships with Mali, hoping to access the source of the gold that had disrupted their economies. Maps began appearing in European courts, showing Mali as a major power, with Musa depicted sitting on a golden throne, holding a massive golden orb. But with this recognition came danger. Europe was beginning to understand that Africa wasn't the primitive continent. They had imagined it was an economic superpower that had been hiding in plain sight. The true cost of Mansa Musa's generosity didn't become clear until years after his return to Mali. What he had accomplished in a few months of gift-giving created economic instability that lasted for an entire decade. The gold market across North Africa and the Middle East remained depressed until the mid-1330s, fundamentally altering trade relationships across 3 continents. But the chaos went deeper than simple price fluctuations. Musa's display of wealth had shattered European assumptions about global economics. Medieval European scholars had built their understanding of international trade on the belief that Europe was the primary source of manufactured wealth, while Africa provided only raw materials and labor. Suddenly, they were confronted with evidence of an African civilization that was not just wealthy, but wealthy enough to destabilize their entire economic system through casual generosity. Nowhere was this more apparent than in Venice, the commercial heart of medieval Europe. Venetian merchants had built fortunes on carefully calculated trade routes that balanced the scarcity and abundance of various commodities. Gold from Africa, spices from Asia, manufactured goods from Europe. The whole system depended on predictable supply and demand. Musa's pilgrimage broke that predictability. Venetian records from the late 1320s describe merchants struggling to understand whether African gold was abundant or scarce. If one man could carry 21 tons on a religious journey, how much more existed? Should they increase their African trade expeditions, or would they flood their own markets? The uncertainty created what we would recognize today as a classic market bubble and crash. Some Venetian merchants invested heavily in African trade expeditions, hoping to access Musa's source of wealth. Others, convinced that African gold was too abundant to be profitable, shifted their investments elsewhere. The result was wild price swings that lasted for years. Perhaps the most significant consequence of Musa's pilgrimage was cartographic. Before 1324, European maps barely acknowledged Africa's existence. The continent was typically depicted as a blank space or filled with mythical creatures. After news of Musa's wealth spread, European mapmakers began frantically trying to understand African geography. The famous Catalan Atlas of 1375 depicts Mansa Musa sitting on his throne in Mali, holding a golden scepter, with the inscription, "This Negro lord is called Musa Mali, lord of the Negroes of Guinea. So abundant is the gold which is found in his country, that he is the richest and most noble king in all the land." This wasn't just updated geography. It was a fundamental shift in how Europeans understood global power structures. For the first time, European maps acknowledged an African ruler as a major world power, equal to or greater than European monarchs. But Musa's display of wealth created a dangerous long-term consequence that he couldn't have anticipated. By revealing Mali's extraordinary riches to the world, he had essentially painted a target on his empire. European and Middle Eastern powers began to view West Africa not as a distant trading partner, but as a source of wealth that could be exploited. Within decades of Musa's death, around 1337, Portuguese expeditions began probing the West African coast, explicitly seeking the source of Mali's gold. These expeditions would eventually lead to the Atlantic slave trade and centuries of European exploitation of Africa. Ironically, Musa's generosity, intended to demonstrate Islamic charity and African power, became the intelligence that would eventually enable European colonization of the continent. The economic disruption caused by Musa's pilgrimage also created problems within Mali itself. Provincial governors, who had been loyal when the empire's wealth was a closely guarded secret, became restless when they realized how much wealth Musa had given away to foreigners. In the early 1330s, several outlying provinces attempted to break away from Mali, arguing that if the emperor could afford to give away fortunes to Egyptian merchants, he was overtaxing his own people. Musa was forced to launch military campaigns to maintain his empire's unity, campaigns that were expensive and revealed the first signs of Mali's future decline. The most tragic irony of Mansa Musa's story is that his greatest strength became his greatest weakness. The same generous nature that made him legendary also made his empire vulnerable. By the time of his death, Mali was still incredibly wealthy, but it was no longer the mysterious, unopposed economic superpower it had been before his pilgrimage. European merchants now knew where Mali's gold came from and how much wealth the empire possessed. Middle Eastern powers had measured their own treasuries against Musa's generosity and found themselves lacking. The secret was out, and with it went Mali's greatest strategic advantage, the element of surprise. Musa had transformed his empire from a hidden economic superpower into a known target. His legendary generosity had made him famous, but fame, in the medieval world, was often a prelude to conquest. When Mansa Musa died around 1337, he left behind more than just an empire. He had fundamentally altered how the world understood wealth, power, and generosity. His pilgrimage to Mecca remains the most economically disruptive religious journey in human history, a perfect storm of good intentions and devastating consequences. In the years immediately following Musa's death, the Mali Empire began its slow decline. Without his unifying presence and economic genius, provincial governors started asserting independence. The trans-Saharan trade routes that had made Mali wealthy became contested territories. European expeditions, inspired by tales of Musa's wealth, began establishing footholds on the West African coast. By 1400, less than a century after Musa's death, Mali had fragmented into smaller kingdoms. The Songhai Empire rose to control parts of Mali's former territory, but never achieved the same level of centralized wealth or international influence. Perhaps Musa's most significant long-term impact was on European consciousness. His pilgrimage shattered medieval Europe's assumptions about African poverty and primitiveness. European scholars were forced to acknowledge that Africa contained civilizations as sophisticated and wealthy as their own. This recognition had complex consequences. On one hand, it led to increased diplomatic contact and trade relationships between Europe and Africa. On the other hand, it made Africa a target for European expansion and exploitation. The Portuguese expeditions of the late 14th and early 15th centuries were directly inspired by European awareness of African wealth, awareness that stemmed largely from Mansa Musa's legendary generosity. In a tragic historical irony, the pilgrimage intended to demonstrate Islamic piety and African power, provided the intelligence that would eventually enable European colonization of the continent. Modern economists studying Mansa Musa's pilgrimage have identified several principles that remain relevant today. His accidental creation of inflation demonstrates how massive wealth transfers can destabilize entire economic systems. His monopoly over gold supply shows how control of crucial resources can create almost unlimited political power. Most importantly, his story illustrates the complex relationship between wealth and security. Musa's riches made Mali powerful, but they also made it a target. His generosity made him legendary, but it also revealed strategic information to potential enemies. What makes Mansa Musa's story so compelling is its moral ambiguity. Was he a generous ruler following religious principles, or an economic imperialist who destabilized international finance for personal glory? Was his pilgrimage an act of piety, or a display of power designed to intimidate rivals? The answer is probably both. Musa appears to have been genuinely religious, but he was also a sophisticated political strategist who understood that displays of wealth were forms of international diplomacy. His generosity was real, but it was also carefully calculated to demonstrate Mali's power to the Islamic world. In our current era of extreme wealth concentration and global economic interconnection, Mansa Musa's story offers surprising insights. His ability to influence international markets through individual actions mirrors the power that modern billionaires wield over global economics. His accidental creation of economic instability through well-intentioned actions echoes modern concerns about unintended consequences of massive wealth transfers, whether through philanthropy, investment, or consumption. Most importantly, his story reminds us that assumptions about global power structures can be catastrophically wrong. Medieval Europe's blindness to African wealth mirrors modern misconceptions about global economic relationships. As you consider Mansa Musa's incredible story, ask yourself, what would you have done in his position? When faced with almost unlimited wealth and deep religious convictions about charity, how would you balance generosity with responsibility? How do we measure the success of a ruler who achieved legendary status but inadvertently exposed his empire to future conquest? Was Musa's pilgrimage a triumph of religious devotion or a strategic disaster that doomed his empire? And perhaps most importantly, in our modern world of extreme wealth inequality, what lessons can we learn from the story of a man whose generosity was so extreme it became dangerous? Ultimately, Mansa Musa remains one of history's most fascinating contradictions. A man so wealthy he could afford to crash international gold markets, so generous he gave away fortunes to strangers, and so powerful that his acts of charity became weapons of economic warfare. His story challenges our assumptions about medieval Africa, about the relationship between wealth and power, and about the unintended consequences of even the most well-intentioned actions. 6 centuries after his death, we're still trying to calculate his net worth, still debating his motivations, and still grappling with the implications of his extraordinary life. In a world obsessed with billionaires and economic disruption, Mansa Musa remains the ultimate example of how individual wealth can reshape global systems. He was the richest person who ever lived. But more than that, he was a man whose generosity was so extreme it became dangerous, not just to his enemies, but to the entire economic order of the medieval world. What do you think? Was Mansa Musa a generous hero or an economic disruptor whose actions had devastating unintended consequences? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most extraordinary figures, make sure to subscribe for more stories about the hidden forces that shaped our world. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the world isn't greed or violence, it's generosity so extreme that it changes everything.